This video is going to be somewhat technical, and I expect that it's not going to be particularly interesting for most of the viewers. Only those who study the Jewish halachic texts like Mishna Berura, Biur Halacha, for them this might be useful, and it has, of course, a real important consequence. The possible chidush that I want to present here has a great nafkamina, what's called, that's how we call in Aramaic, a Talmudic term, something that comes out of it, meaning something that has practical application. And that is, of course, the standard halacha says, based on the Talmud in Tractate Berachot, the Shulchan Aruch says that you have to specifically have concentration when you recite the first blessing of the Shmone Esre. What's called kavanah. You have to understand what you're saying. If a person, for instance, doesn't know the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, that well, and when he prays the rest of the main prayer, the Shmone Esre, he doesn't really understand everything he's saying, or let's say he does understand the Hebrew language, but he has other thoughts. It's very difficult often to concentrate on the prayers. He's a busy person. He has all kinds of other worries, and when he's praying, his mind kind of travels in all kinds of directions, and he barely remembers and concentrates on his prayers. At the very least, he has to try to concentrate on the first blessing. If the first bracha is said without concentration, then his whole prayer is not really, he's not yotzeh, he doesn't fulfill his obligation to pray. The first bracha is the most important bracha. There are some Rishonim who say also that the modim, the pre-last brocha, where we thank Hashem, also is very important. But the first bracha, according to everybody, is mi'akev. It's the main concentration. It has to be on the first bracha. If one cannot concentrate even there, then his Shmone Esre might not even be a real prayer. So the chidush, the interesting understanding of the author of the Mishna Berura, of course, we call this person Chafetz Chaim, but really Chafetz Chaim is not the proper name. It's the name of a book, just like Mishna Berura is the name of the book. Chafetz Chaim is based on a verse, Mi ha'ish Chafetz Chaim, a person who desires life, Chafetz Chaim, the one who wants life has to keep his tongue, guard his tongue, and not say bad things about others, not gossip. So since the Chafetz Chaim became famous through this book, the book Chafetz Chaim deals with these issues of prohibition of Lashon Hara, forbidden speech. Therefore, the author, whose name was Rabbi Israel Meir HaKohen, they started calling him, according to the book, the name of the book, Chafetz Chaim. So the author, Chafetz Chaim, the author of Mishna Berura in Biur Halacha, learns from a certain sage who lived in Barcelona in Spain, some, I think, 700 or so years ago. He was one of the Rishonim, what's called, the sages that lived about 1,000 to 500 years ago. They're called early sages. So he's a very important early sage, Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Aderet. And this sage writes in his commentary to Tractate Berachot that something that Chafetz Chaim understands to mean that if a person digresses, thinks about other things in the middle of the first bracha, even if at that time he was quiet and he didn't continue praying. Because the law is, if a person has other thoughts in the middle of prayer, he should stop, remove those thoughts, and continue. So let's say that happened in the first blessing. In the middle of the first blessing, he started thinking other thoughts, and he was able to concentrate back on his prayers and continued the prayer. So when he pronounced the words of the prayer, he was concentrating, he had kavanah. It's just in the middle somewhere, he had other thoughts as well, between pronouncing some of the phrases of the first blessing. And the Chafetz Chaim understands from the words of Rashba that even in such a case, he might not fulfill his obligation. Listen again, this is a very big chidush, this is a very novel understanding and a very strict understanding. Meaning what he's trying to say is that not only a person who doesn't concentrate at all during his prayers and just says the words, of course he doesn't fulfill his obligation, but even if he does concentrate when he talks to Hashem, but in the middle if he had other thoughts, and then he removed those thoughts and continued to pray correctly with concentration, he still might not be fulfilling his obligation. And that's the chidush that I want to argue with. Of course, I'm nowhere near the level of Chafetz Chaim. This is pretty obvious to everyone. There's nothing to discuss even here. Between me and Chafetz Chaim is like between heaven and earth. The difference of our understanding of the Talmud is not just a small difference. Of course, the knowledge of Chofetz Chaim was far, far greater. We're not going to even discuss this. But one has to understand Chofetz Chaim was a very, very righteous man. He was a Hasid. I'm not talking about Hasid as a group of Hasidim, what we call Hasidim today. Or rather, we want to say that Hasid meaning very righteous person. And to him, such a thing could at least occur, that a person who has other thoughts during the middle of the brocha might not be fulfilling his obligation. In my opinion, this seems extremely far-fetched already, because that would make 99% of the people not fulfill their obligation during prayer. Because very few people can say the entire first bracha. It's not a small bracha. It takes maybe half a minute, a quarter of a minute, probably more than a quarter of a minute to say the whole bracha. So it certainly is very difficult to have no thoughts at all except on what you're saying for the entire bracha. Every single day, 3 times a day. So to imagine that very few people will ever fulfill or always fulfill the obligation of prayer would be very difficult in my mind. But a Hasid, a very righteous person like Chofetz Chaim could imagine such a thing, because probably his prayers were very clean and pure and with great concentration. But to me it seems that this is a far-fetched understanding. And I have many proofs for this, but I'll bring just one on this lesson. And that is, what's the law when a person actually does get distracted in the middle of the Shmone Esre? If, for instance, he started being busy with something else, or something distracted him, or even he had to talk. This is all forbidden, by the way. You're not supposed to pause to talk in the middle of Shmone Esre. It's the most important prayer, and one has to be only concentrating on the prayer. But let's say it happened. A person talked in the middle of Shmone Esre. Forgot, for instance, and started talking, or whatever happened that was interrupting his prayers. What's the law in such a case? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins like this, that if he interrupted for the time that it would take to say the entire Shmone Esre, at his speed. Every person davens differently at different speed, but let's say it takes me 5 minutes to say Shmone Esre. So if I interrupted for 5 minutes, whatever was the reason for interruption, doesn't matter. Let's say he had to go to the bathroom, or some other reason. According to Shulchan Aruch, he has to start all over. He has to start the prayer all over. However, if the interruption was not as long, it was a shorter interruption, then he has to start from the beginning of the blessing he was in. To return to the beginning of that bracha. Shmone Esre has altogether 19 brachot, so somewhere in the middle, if he interrupted or even talked, he'd have to go back to the beginning of that bracha. The same would be true if, for instance, he decided to answer Kaddish. He's not supposed to answer anything during Shmone Esre, but if he did, he'd have to go to the beginning of that bracha. However, if it's the first 3 blessings or the last 3, they're all considered as one. So a person who talked or interrupted in some way in the middle of the last 3 blessings goes back to the first of those 3, to Brocha Retzeh. Similarly, if it's the first 3 blessings, he goes back to the beginning of Shmone Esre. All of that are words of Shulchan Aruch. However, Rashba actually argues with it. The opinion of the Rashba, as the Vilna Gaon also brings in his commentary to Shulchan Aruch, is that he does not have to go back to the beginning at all. Neither the beginning of bracha, nor the beginning of the group of 3 brachot, unless the interruption was as long as it takes to say the entire Shmone Esre. If the interruption was shorter, he interrupted for half a minute or a minute, he'd just continue from where he stopped. So I think that's a full proof that even a person who not only didn't think about other things, presumably this law applies to the first bracha as well. There's no difference in this law between the first bracha and other brachot. Anywhere where in the middle of Shmone Esre a person starts thinking about something else, or even he talked about something else, or made an interruption in some other way, went to the bathroom, or whatever the case may be, any interruption. If the interruption was not as long as to say the entire Shmone Esre, he'd never have to go back at all, according to Rashba. So Rashba himself holds that you just continue from where you stopped. So Kal Vachomer says, how much more so if a person just simply had other thoughts in the middle of the Brocha of Shmone Esre. He certainly fulfills his obligation after he removed those thoughts and continued. So the Rashba's words must be interpreted that when he's talking about a person who has other thoughts, he's not talking about a person who had other thoughts in the middle of the bracha and then continued. Rather, it's a person who has other thoughts during the bracha itself. A person who, instead of davening to Hashem and thinking about what he's saying, has other thoughts. That's the case when Rashba says he doesn't fulfill his obligations, meaning it's not because of the other thoughts, but because he's not thinking about Shmone Esre, he's thinking other thoughts. So he's saying to Hashem, and meanwhile thinking other thoughts. That's the case when Rashba says he has to pray all over. His prayers do not get accepted. But if a person had, in the middle of Shmone Esre, even in the first bracha, somewhere, he had other thoughts, but then he removed those thoughts and continued and said the bracha with concentration, that Lenut Dati, in my humble opinion, the Rashba would agree that he does fulfill his obligation, and that's in fact what we tell him to do. If in fact he had other thoughts somewhere in the middle, he should remove those thoughts and continue from where he left off. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.